A routine flight over the Hawaiian Islands turns chaotic. A loud bang is heard, followed by cold air filling the cabin. The pilots, fighting to keep the plane in the air, desperately look for a place to land. What caused this plane to lose a large chunk of its fuselage? And could it happen again? This is Aloha Airlines 243. Aloha Airlines Flight 243 was a regularly scheduled flight from Hilo International Airport in Hawaii to Honolulu International Airport in Oahu. The plane operating the flight today was a Boeing 737-200 with registration November 73711. November 73711 was first flown with Aloha Airlines in 1969 before cycling back and forth between Aloha and Air California, later renamed Air Cal. Then ending up back with Aloha Airlines in 1983 and staying with the airline until the incident date. Now, something important to note is that airplanes have a designed flight life. This design life is set by the airline manufacturer and is to ensure the safe operation of the airplane to a given point. Kinda like an expiration date on food at a grocery store. The key difference between planes and a loaf of bread is that, unlike the loaf of bread, a plane is not so impacted by time as it is use. This usage of airplanes is typically measured in flight cycles and flight hours, flight cycles being the more important of the two. I will get more into this in a few minutes. The flight crew of today's flight consists of 44-year-old Captain Robert Schornsteimer and 36-year-old First Officer Madeline Tompkins. Schornsteimer was an experienced pilot with 8,500 flight hours under his belt, including 6,700 on the 737. Tompkins was also an experienced pilot and had 8,000 flight hours, including 3,500 logged on the 737. The flight was also joined by 3 flight attendants and 90 passengers, totaling out to 95 occupants on board. At around 1:15 p.m., Flight 243 would push back and start its 2 engines. At 1:25 p.m., Aloha Airlines Flight 243 departs Hilo International Airport en route for Honolulu. At 1:40 p.m., and now cruising at 24,000 feet, Aloha Airlines 243 begins to fly over the Alinruhaha Channel. Known for its depth and rough seas, this 30-mile stretch of water is closer in comparison to the Pacific itself than the surrounding coastline. However, cruising high above this channel, the passengers aren't worried about this and are instead working on getting their affairs in order for their arrival in Honolulu. As far as they're aware, this flight is just like any other. Now, I mentioned flight hours and flight cycles a minute ago, and I think a bit more of an explanation is needed to understand what's about to happen. A flight hour is just how many total hours the plane has been in the air. Pretty simple. The other is a little more complex. A flight cycle is made up of the pressurization and depressurization of the cabin to make a total flight. This is important because as the cabin pressurizes, the skin of the airplane expands ever so slightly and compresses back to its original state after it depressurizes. This stretching of the skin over and over can cause cracks to start to develop on the pressure cabin. Now, in normal circumstances, this wouldn't be an issue, but for a 19-year-old 737 that does dozens of short flights per day, it becomes a problem. This airframe in particular had over 89,600 flight cycles, well beyond the recommended 75,000. An airplane can keep flying past its designed flight life, however, it would require heavy amounts of maintenance, something that, as we will find out later, was not the case in this accident. After thousands of flights, the cabin started to gather little microscopic fissures and cracks, and it all came to a head at around 1:48 p.m. on the 28th of April, when the roof finally gave way. Moments after the explosion, the autopilot disconnects and the cabin altitude alarm goes off. The captain grabs his controls and begins to wrestle the plane level. This, however, is harder to do than normal, as the explosion severed hydraulic lines to the flight controls. This causes the controls to go to manual reversion, which is only cables and pulleys. The explosion also blew the cockpit door inwards, landing in between the two pilots. The temperature in the cabin also goes from a comfy 68 degrees Fahrenheit to -16, and the air becomes way too thin to breathe. The pilots are quick to don their oxygen masks. The passengers that have a roof also attempt to put on a mask. However, the explosion cut the oxygen lines in the cabin, thus no air flows through the masks. Without breathable air, the passengers and flight attendants will become hypoxic if the pilots don't get the airplane down within the next few minutes. After the pilots take in their immediate situation, they both agree to begin an emergency descent. The captain slowly puts the plane in a dive as the first officer grabs out the quick reference handbook. As the plane dives and picks up speed, it starts to shudder violently, making it hard for the pilots to read the instruments in the QRH. Both pilots know the plane has suffered some kind of decompression. However, the severity of the damage only becomes apparent as the first officer attempts to inform the cabin crew that an emergency descent is underway. She tries to call them through the interphone, but when this fails, she looks back into the cabin to check on the situation, only to find blue skies mere feet from the back of her seat. Upon realizing the roof is missing, she looks back to the captain, wide-eyed, and gestures behind them. After taking a quick peek, the true extent of the damage is now apparent to him. A section of roof approximately 18 feet long, extending from just behind the forward galley to the leading edge of the wing, is now missing. With this in mind, he now has to run through a few quick decisions. First, the plane is currently missing a key structural element. How the plane has held together thus far, he has no idea. What he does know is that it won't hold long. Getting the plane down sooner rather than later is preferable. By this point, the plane is just off the coast of the island of Maui. From memory, both pilots know that Maui has a decently sized airport in the city of Honolulu. The only problem is, with how close the plane is to the island, they're going to have to stay in a dive the whole way down. What the captain doesn't want is to overspeed the airplane and have it disintegrate in midair. He puts up two options: fly straight into the airport and risk overstressing the airplane, or circle the airport and risk more things failing. He goes with option A. After the decision is made, the first officer tunes into the tower at Kwahalui and declares an emergency.
Maui Tower, Aloha 243, we're in dock for landing. Descending out of 13, and we have rapid decompression. We are pressurized, declaring an emergency.
Hello, 243, clear your position.
Request current into Maui for landing. Request the equipment.
243, the equipment is on the roll. Plane straight in runway 2, and I'll keep you advised on any wind change.
We're going to need assistance. We cannot communicate with the flight attendant. We'll need assistance for the passengers when we land.
Okay, I understand you're going to need an ambulance, is that correct?
Affirmative.
Hello, 243, can you give me your souls on board and your fuel on board?
We, 86 plus 5 crew members.
Roger, how many do you think are injured?
We have no idea. We cannot communicate with our flight attendants.
Okay, we'll have ambulance on the way.
With the air traffic control now informed and the ground equipment on the roll, the flight crew's priorities switch from finding an airport to land at to now getting there. At this point, the plane is now below 11,000 feet, so the pilots take off their oxygen masks to communicate more freely. One of their immediate concerns that they start to discuss is their speed in proximity to the airport. In fact, the plane is still going over 300 knots, 100 knots faster than they would normally be going at their current distance of around 15 miles from the field. In order to bleed some speed off, the captain asks for the landing gear to be extended. His hopes are that the landing gear would cause enough drag to help slow the plane down. However, once the landing gear is extended, a new problem now arises.
Okay, be advised, we have no nose gear. We are landing without the nose gear. Only all the equipment is done.
As the first officer lowers the landing gear, the gear position indicators tell the pilots that the two main sets of wheels dropped and locked in place. However, it shows the nose gear did not. The pilots now worry that they will have to perform a no nose gear landing, with which the plane, in its current structural state, might not survive. Aside from the fact that the nose gear might not have dropped, something the pilots were also wary about is how the plane might control at slower speeds and on landing. As the speed started to decrease, the captain noticed that the controls were getting heavier. In order to counter this, he then decided to play around with the flaps. He asked the first officer to put the flaps down to 15. Once at flaps 15, however, they both decided to bring the flaps up a bit as the controls got heavier past flaps 5. With the flaps set, gear down, and the runway now in sight, all the flight crew had to do was bring the speed back. Then, as they neared the airport, they both got the news they were looking for. The tower controller at Maui sighted the airplane through some binoculars, noted the nose gear was down, and relayed this to the flight crew. The pilots breathed a quick sigh of relief now that they knew their landing gear was down. The last unknown at this point was if the plane would hold under the stresses of landing. 1 minute out, and both the pilots, passengers, flight attendants, and tower controllers held their breaths.
Well, 243, just shut her down where you are. Everything's fine. The gear, the fire trucks are on the way.
After the plane came to a stop, the pilots shut down their engines and ordered an evacuation. Kahului did not have a plan to counter the magnitude of this emergency, and subsequently did not have enough ambulances in the city to transport all of the injured. Instead, a touring company was called to assist with the effort. Later that day, it was revealed that Chief Flight Attendant Clarabelle Lansing was missing, and the passengers had told authorities that she had gotten sucked out during the explosion. A search party looked for her at the approximate point of impact, but called off the search a few days later. She was the only fatality. An investigation would be conducted shortly after the incident and found a corroded lap joint to be at fault. Contributing to the accident was Aloha Airlines maintenance's failure to properly service and inspect the airplane for metal fatigue. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded the following in their final report. Quote, "The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of this incident was the failure of Aloha Airlines' maintenance program to detect the presence of significant disbonding and fatigue damage, which ultimately led to the failure of the lap joint at S-10L and the separation of the fuselage's upper lobe." Contributing to the accident were the failure of Aloha Airlines' management to supervise properly its maintenance force, the failure of the FAA to require Airworthiness Directive 87-21-08 inspection of all the lap joints proposed by Boeing Alert Service Bulletin SB 737-53A 1039, and the lack of complete terminating action neither generated by Boeing nor required by the FAA after the discovery of early production difficulties in the Boeing 737 cold bond lap joint, which resulted in low bond durability, corrosion, and premature fatigue cracking. The airplane in question was production line number 152, one of the earlier 737s to be produced. Due to the weaknesses found with the previous method of bonding the metal, all 737s after line number 291 received extra reinforcement at the lap joints. November 737-11 did not have this reinforcement. This, plus the lackluster maintenance, made this airplane a ticking time bomb. The lessons learned from Aloha Airlines 243 helped reinforce the need for more adequate maintenance for all 737s below line number 291 and for all airplanes nearing the end of their service lives. Since Aloha 243, there has not been a rapid decompression event as severe as the one on April 28, 1988. Let's hope it stays that way.